Let me see. This is good. This is good. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored today to have Tom Zlatic. We had his co-author, Sara, last time. Sara and Tom have worked on this book by Walter Ong, that he worked on towards the end of, only book-length manuscript that he worked on towards the end of his life. And they have done the magnificent work of putting it together and publishing it for us. So it's so wonderful to have Tom here. So welcome, Tom.
Thank you.
So Tom, let's start with, who was Walter Ong? What was he about? And what do so when did you come across Father Ong, and can you talk a little bit about that?
1969, height of the Vietnam War, 1A status in my back pocket. I walk up into St. Louis University's office of Father McNamee to begin a fellowship, thinking I wasn't going to complete it, and to sign up for courses. And I was going to sign up for a course that looked very interesting, that dealt with existentialism in literature. Mm-hmm. And Father McNamee kind of looked at me in a very fatherly way and said, well, you know, you're just starting your program here. Why don't you try something else now and take Father Ong's course later? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which I did. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, because of the many visiting professorships that he has had and my own schedule, I wasn't able to take that course. In fact, I was only able to take one other course from Father Ong while I was there over a 5-year period. But I did sit in every course that I could unofficially, including in 1988. The last time I sat in was for Father Ong's course on being and interpretation, which was the subject matter of the last book that was finally put together. He rejected it in 1993, and we tried to bring it back to life. So Father Ong has been an important person in my life. It would be impertinent for me to call him a friend, but he did come to the house occasionally for dinner, and he did help to celebrate in the college church my daughter's wedding. But it was really after he died that I got even deeper insight, because he left behind him in the archives thousands and thousands of papers that dealt with almost everything that he did in life, including cleaning his teeth and what course that he took. And because I lived in St. Louis all my life, I was able to run down there every day for months, trying to snap together all this material. And he had, and if anybody's interested, it's a fascinating place, although right now, because of COVID, they're closed down probably until August. But he has there all the courses that he's taken, the notes for the courses, all the presentations that he gave, papers that people delivered to him, personal notes about who got Christmas cards or not. I came away with a very deeper impression of what Father Ong actually accomplished. He was obviously, anybody would know, a polyglot and a polymath. He was, you know, one of the last 20th century intellectuals, old school intellectual. He knew 6 languages. He was an expert on everything. Played trivia. If you want to know who invented the zipper, he'll tell you. If you want to know the second person who used a zipper, he can tell you. The Jesuits that were younger, that were living with him in Jesuit Hall, tried to play games with him to catch him with something he didn't know. And after weeks, they finally caught him with something he didn't know about the service library at the other end of the building. Yeah. We never did know exactly what Father Ong did. And so One person, I think, or more, invented the term English. He had a degree in English, but English was a very unique approach to what he was doing. And through his time at the university, he's had many titles. He was professor of English, but he was also professor of English and professor of psychiatry. He was university professor, meaning that they didn't know what to do with him either, so he could just teach whatever he wanted to. He was one of the last people that I know of at St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit school, to begin his class with a prayer. He's asked people to stand up if they so wished and to pray. And I think there was only one other person I can remember that was doing that. But he was by no means conservative in his theological outlook. He was very much on the vanguard of things. He was trying to understand religion in terms of a 16.5 billion year universe. And that's what he was, one of the things that he was pressing for was a theology that took in the fact that human beings came out of a long period of time. And he was interested in the evolution of human consciousness out of consciousness. He was the president of the MLA, I would guess the only president of the MLA who was a Jesuit priest. I think that probably will hold for a while. He had an international reputation when he was in Paris working on his dissertation. In the Jesuit house, he was 4 or 5 rooms down from Teilhard de Chardin. I think you could tell I'm impressed. Mm-hmm. But what he often talked about was the milieu of St. Louis University at the time. He had pointed out that at SLU at the time, there were many people that were somewhere in the process of becoming priests. In addition, there were other people that were interested in the classics. And he said there were hundreds of people that were familiar with Latin and the whole European tradition. People in English, theology, philosophy, were interested in the sensorium, the arrangement of the senses, and what impact they had on cognition. Okay. In addition, he continued his priestly duties, counseling people, and probably there's a couple of thousand letters that he has to people who have written to him asking advice about faith or thanking him for something that he's done for them. So he was a genuine person.
Wow. Well, I love this because this is like the broadband introduction to the person, and that's, that is the right place to start. Now, he's known for, what he's most known for is his book on orality and literacy, and the entire line of thought that kind of comes from that. So let's talk about that. What was his work on orality and literacy?
If I can back up 2 steps, I think it was his most popular book and his most famous book, but it wasn't his best book. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of people who have read only that book may have walked away with some misunderstandings and some blames, perhaps, about what Father Ong was doing there. If I could go back, Anna Arendt was a fellow along with Father Ong in Connecticut. They had a lot of conversations, but he wrote at one time that she told him, "Walter, you have a dialectical mind." And he said, I thought this and still think it, but it was very good to hear it from probably the best known dialectician in the country. And I think we have to look at that dialectical factor going on as we're talking about orality and literacy. Ong himself said he said many things about what he was doing, but one thing he said, if I can read it, his work deals with antithesis and conflict, a focus in verbal communication, but the work is synthesizing and unifying in bent. Okay. And I'm suggesting that orality and literacy is part of a long list of pairs, of dialectical pairs, that all kind of converged on each other. Rhetoric and logic, for instance. He could look at European civilization over the last 2,000 years and interpret it in terms of what's going on in each of those. His Ramus book, for instance, was an example of that. Mythos and logos, oral and visual, ear and the eye, open system versus closed system thinking, unconsciousness versus consciousness, spoken versus written, but written, silent versus spoken, integration versus alienation, interiorization versus externalization, aphorisms versus method, literature versus history, religion versus science, right hemisphere versus left hemisphere, and hermeneutics versus digitization, which was what his last book was about. And through his career, I think he was usually pouncing on one or more of these and leading ahead. And of course, he could be interpreted many ways, but he did not privilege one over the other. He said both were necessary and had to interact. Okay. So at St. Louis University, in the air was talk about phenomenological study of the sensorium, how senses are involved in cognition. And Ong, along with Mcluhan, I think, said that the medium one is using is part of what's being communicated. The medium presents predispositions so that we can use the phrase, I'll believe it when I see it, but also I'll see it when I believe it. Okay. So that the sensory mode that we're using shapes our perception of things and has an impact on what we think and how we think and why we think. So I hope you can see I'm leading up to orality and literacy here. In particular, in his sensorium, his phenomenological investigation sensorium, he focused on orality and sight. And have you heard this before? If you ever heard him at all, you may have heard this one before because he told it everywhere. But he said, you know, if you turn around and look in the back of the room now, you may not have noticed it, but there's a dead buffalo. And I can see the dead buffalo back there. And I think it's been there for a couple of days because I can smell the dead buffalo. And just to be safe, I went back and gently touched the dead buffalo. And then it had a wound in it, and I just dipped my finger in its blood, and I tasted the dead buffalo. He said, but when you hear the dead buffalo, you better run. So that the oral he associated with activity and something that's ongoing. Mm-hmm. He said sound deals with depths. The depth of the words coming out of myself, going through the air and lining up inside of you. It deals with interiors. He says, if you want to know if a barrel is full or empty, you will sound it. Or if you're trying to hang a picture on the wall and trying to find the stud, you can tap on the wall so that sound can get to interiors without destroying the exterior. Sight, on the other hand, deals with surfaces. And there's always a stage in front of you with sight With sound, you're always surrounded by it. So it's participatory in nature rather than observational. So at one point early in his career, he picked up on the notion that the Hebrews' sense of knowing was related to the word dabar, which means to hear, whereas the Greeks' sense of knowing was sight. You may be familiar with Matthew Arnold's Hebraism and Hellenism, where it kind of picks up the same point in a different way, but he said the Greek gods are visible. We have statues of them. They're like us. But the Hebrew God is a burning bush. It's a voice speaking in the night. It can't be seen. And the emphasis for the Hebrews would be on obedience, on strictness of conscience, whereas the Greeks were interested, according to Matthew Arnold, in the spontaneity of consciousness. So, orality is actually more than one thing, I think, for Ong. Orality is not simply speaking, as I am now, for instance. I'm speaking, but that's not orality. It's oral, but it's not what Ong means by orality. He's talking about a condition taking place in a particular time and a place where the only medium they have for communication would be voice or sound. And likewise, when we get into the later periods, the Middle Ages, and even until 19th century America, he says there continues on a habit of mind, which he calls residual orality. Mm-hmm. Writing and even print are now exist, but continuing on are the methods of thinking that apply to this. This is one thing that I picked up with Father Ong during the 90s, and trying to show how this would fit in with Mark Twain, for instance, or Herman Melville, how the residual orality shaped what Mark Twain was doing. Having a young boy kind of pre-literate versus the world of hypocrisy, which is associated with writing. Or Mark Twain's book on Joan of Arc portrays her as someone who can't speak, or can't read rather, but she had greatness of heart and wonderful talent at speaking aloud. Okay, so aside from orality and secondary orality, and script, the alphabetic script, and the electronic world. So in the oral world, Ong says, if you look at the Iliad or the Odyssey, of course, other people have said this. I'm sure you're familiar with all those people. But just to summarize quickly, in an oral world, there is no means of communication, of memorization other than the human mind. Not entirely true. We can have sticks and we can have notches and we can have clay tablets and so on. But in order to tell a story, he said, the story had to be a story that's already been known. And it's working with loose plots rather than tightly knitted plots that are based upon formulas, things that we've already known and have been employed before, that have a certain rhythm and balance that we can pick up, that has repetition and focuses on social identity, not the individual. In fact, there is very little on the interiors of people in the oral culture. The work is homeostatic, in that what you say changes depending on what the current needs of your society are. So if the king has six sons and they were all great people, we tell the story. But if one of those sons turned out to be a villain, the next time we tell the story is the king had 5 sons. What's important is not the fact, but the impact it has on the people. Writing, on the other hand, he says, begins an internalization process. Now we start to see ourselves as a text. We begin to see that a plot should be more tightly plotted, that it deals more so with alienation from a group. If we look at Antigone, for instance, now, who comes out of a writing culture, because we know that plays need to have writing in order to have all the people speaking together at the same time. It's being internalized. And so what's changing is the what, how, and why of what's important. Ong was not saying that one of these forms is better than the other. He was not saying that we need to go back into the past, to the good old days where people were huddled together, happy in their huts. He was not being critical of people who did not have writing, but that was a way of being, that their orality was functioning as a prism by which they interpret the world.
Wonderful. Shall I ask, do you want to complete your thought or shall I ask some questions?
I'd say go on.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that comes out when I look at Father Ong's approach to this is that it's profoundly humanistic approach. He has an empathy for the human, regardless, across all these stages. And he tries to understand them in their own technological environment. Does not put down either of them, just said, this is what it is. And it is profound to trace different varieties of it across the technological spectrum. So, so somebody like Plato, when he discovers writing, he banishes the poets from his republics, saying, setting up the conflict between logos and mythos. Whereas if you look at something like Bible, you're talking about the Hebrews, the logos and mythos are connected. It's the allegories and the parables actually bring to life the logos, and they work together. And I think that's where Father Ong is coming from, that these two, you talked about these various dialectics between figure and ground, between unconscious and conscious, between logos and mythos. And Father Ong, the best I understand him is that he is going always back and forth, showing how each supports the other and brings it to a new level. Like, for example, let's take the scribal stage, where now writing is taking place. But then there are these people who are writing with their hands. There is a feedback loop going on between them and the writing in their consciousness, but they're also engaging in very deep dialogue with other people doing the same. So the orality actually supplements the writing to produce a grasp of the world, which is much, much higher. But both these things work together. Can you, is this along the lines of how Father Ong thought?
I'm standing here looking at Randy Lupp, thinking how he probably could do a better job of answering this question than I can. Can you put the question in one sentence for me?
Sure. How does, after the invention of writing, what function does orality serve in human consciousness?
So I think, again, it depends on what you mean by orality. Are you talking about the spoken word, or are you talking about the haptic
That's much better. Yes, spoken word. What's the role of spoken word after writing?
As you, I'm sure, know, Father Ong's, I was going to say his most aggressive work, but probably it isn't. Ramus is probably the work that took the longest and the deepest, but the presence of the word would get into this. Ong, I don't think, is trying to diminish any of the senses, but one stage is necessary in order to lead to another stage. And if I can use this phrase, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, that Ong was about the non-equivalence of ideas and being, the non-equivalence of ideas and being. And this also goes with this idea of mythos, I think, too, as we'll see. So that here is the reality, but it's surrounded by gulfs and shadows and shades. And it brings to mind one of the many phrases that Ong would use, aphorisms, that there is no completely clear and complete sentence. And in class, he loved to do this, not only in class, but in presentations as well. He would give that, and then he would say, invariably, someone would raise their hand and say, what do you mean by that? And he can say, ah, yes, you see. Okay. So the being is always more than we can handle. And the concept is our take on the being, but it's being, again, filtered through one of the senses and one of the paradigms. But then the words come out of the concept. And then the written word further distances the self. Okay. And so Ong wants to get to being, knowing he's not going to do it, but you can get closer and closer as he takes place. And he's not against the electronic world. He's highly in favor of it. He says, technology has been with us. Writing is a technology. The trumpet is a technology. There's nothing wrong with technology. The use of that technology is what we need to be careful about. I don't know if I got your answer.
Yeah. Let me ask it in another way. He talks about writing as digitization, and he talks about the oral hermeneutic. What is the relationship between the two?
Again, I think we're involved again with the dialectic that he has going on. Hermeneutics and interpretation are part of that same thing under different words that have been going on forever in his work. Hermeneutics works from the fact that you can never get to the absolute meaning of something. There's always more to say. There's no last word. You just talk until you get tired, or you get something that's mutually agreeable. Writing intensifies the self. One thing that Ong is about is getting to the self, to achieving consciousness at its depth. He says again, he's interested in the development of consciousness of the self from the beginning of the first 10 to the 43rd second of the universe. How each of those is a precondition for a deeper understanding of what the self is. And that's why the same man that can write a book about fighting for life, which is about neurobiology, can write a book about um, I'm not fainting here.
Mhm.
Gerard Manley Hopkins,
Mhm.
the Jesuit poet. The selfless self of self is what both Jesuits had in mind. That's what that's his goal. Okay, and of course in his Christology, that's what worked up with his religion, his sense of who Christ was, the entering of the divine into time. All that's, I think, of the same piece.
The quote in the book that really stunned me was his saying that metaphysics is the center of his thinking. Can you elaborate on that?
Again, I think Randy is the one that to whom
we'll definitely talk to Randy. So I'm looking.
He was the one to whom Father Ong wrote that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I want to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he 3 or 4 times though he said what he was really about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have another one, or maybe it's the same one here. Yeah, in one way, my concern with such statements of a metaphysical nature and my concern with communication are convertible with one another, as both are convertible with my concern with personalism. So that he says, yes, I am interested in metaphysics, but it's a metaphysics that involve aphoristic statements about what life is and what the good life is, not arguments and theories. And the communication and the metaphysics are convertible. They go back and forth, and they're tied up with personalism, the I-thou relationship, that in order for us to progress, I have to know what you're thinking in order to shape what I'm thinking. When you talk, your words come into me, I interiorize them, and I respond. And then together we work out some type of solution that's beneficial to all of us. Unlike writing as an exemplar, where I write my ideas down, put them off across the T's, put it to the publisher, send it to you, and you pick it up and read it. Okay. There's no environment there. But in communication, the environment is crucial. It's part of the communication. The tone of the voice, the verbal and the physical actions that are taking place, what happened to power relationships that exist, they all influence the conversation, but they're not being captured. It'd be nice, for instance, to be able to take musical notation and tie it to conversation and have the ups and the downs and the elongations and the slides. But we don't have that. So another famous quote that he used was, all text is pretext. The text itself is based upon something that came earlier and something that's grounded in the oral. So he's defending the oral, but not suggesting that it's something that we should return to, but to say it needs a place. This is what I think his oral hermeneutic is. Most of hermeneutics, he says, is visual in terms, but we need to have it balanced by the oral. And I think that's what leads further to the deepening of the self that he's talking about.
So another way of putting it, like when I again read, firstly, I really like your essay at the end of the book, because I think it captures all these issues really, because the thing is, I've studied many thinkers, and I know how hard it is to actually get a sense of where a thinker is coming from, especially somebody whose thinking is so vast in scope, to kind of see the structure of it. So I really, I'm really appreciative of your essay. So, and one of the things that comes about, this is another formulation that I had, is the value of encounters between two consciousnesses, the encounter, and that these encounters as being crucial to building the consciousness, whereas the information that is passing through them is a means of doing that. So this kind of primary importance of such relationships between consciousnesses as, and you can extend it to, like, I, thou can extend to you and God, or you and nature as well. But it's a deep relationship. It's almost like a metaphysical it is a metaphysical relationship. And then all that is passing, using it, like manifestations of communication, are kind of subservient to it. It's happening in that context. So that's how I understand what he's saying, is that or this, he calls it, personal intersubjective trust. He talks about love between people as being kind of the foundations on which this communication is taking place.
Yeah, I think so. The I, thou was an important idea for him, but he always has a little twist,
Mm-hmm.
even with I, thou. And, he thought maybe Buber was limited in his ideas because it didn't have a historical dimension.
Mm-hmm.
And Ong liked to boast, not boast is the wrong word, but to make sure people understood. The epigraph to his book on interfaces of the word, where Wimsatt says to Father Ong, he quotes him, he says, I'm a spaceman, but you're a time man.
Mm-hmm.
And Ong picks up on that very quickly. Space, again, is something that would deal with the visual world, something that blocks. Time, on the other hand, is something that's ongoing, never the same, something that involves interaction to us that's going on. And he thought Buber was too focused on the individual. So that's why he would also move in the direction of other people in personalism. I'm sorry for this.
That's okay.
Trying to think of.
Let me ask one.
Sorry, it's Rosenstock-Huessy.
Okay.
Rosenstock-Huessy would be the one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
We've used the term personalism. What does personalism mean to Father Ong?
I think he's very much in agreement with the pronouns, mm-hmm. I and thou. He has an essay, actually I think he has 2 essays that he wrote that he never published. That's in those thousands of papers in the archives about pronouns. And I think he's not saying anything not anybody else hasn't said about personalism, that I recognize you are an interior and I am an interior. Only I can say I. And my confrontation with you, or even better, the encounter with you, is a way for me to deepening my interior. Okay. I was surprised. I heard you use the word encounter, but in writing the book, how often actually Ong has written about encounters in his work. I guess I just started taking notice. And I did find out that in the the Jesuit training program, the encounter that the individual would have with the retreat master would be very important. And there's a psychology movement going on in the 50s and 60s and 70s, which was the encounter movement. And that's what Ong was suggesting, is that we're not just talking, but we're sharing interiors. And as you mentioned, it's a sharing that's based upon faith and trust, and ultimately is moving towards love.
Excellent.
I've always wondered exactly how that works with the love part. I'm not sure I've seen that as much.
Thank you. Now I want to go to the last section of this interview. There are some amazing people on this call, so I want to wrap up the interview in about 15 minutes or so, and then we are going to go into breakout rooms where there'll be about 8 people, so we can have a free-flowing dialogue, and then everybody gets to come back and ask the best question they can about Father Ong to Tom. Okay, so that's the plan. So I want to focus on 3 thinkers. One is Aquinas, second is Mcluhan, and third one is Julian Jaynes. You made a really interesting comment about St. Louis University, that it had created a milieu where there was a common terminology, people knowing Latin, people steeped in work of Thomas Aquinas. So first question is that, we did meetups on Thomas Aquinas and the ecology of the interior senses. We talked about the cogitative faculty. What was the relationship between the thought of Thomas Aquinas and that of Father Ong?
People have asked Father Ong that, and again, it's in his archives, so I feel pretty confident on this one. The Thomism apparently has more varieties than Coca-Cola does right now. And what was taught in the schools for priestly formation normally was a version of Thomism, was Swarzesian in notion, and it was kind of a dead end for many people. The Pope, Francis, said that it was a waste of time for him to be subjected to that type of philosophy. But Ong always claimed that there was something called St. Louis Thomism. I've tried to track that down and talk to the people in the philosophy department, and they couldn't verify that terminology. But they did say St. Louis University was a leader in Thomistic studies, particularly because of Etienne Guisson and Jacques Martin, who were opening things up, bringing in a historical element. And for someone like Ong, who has been through the process, it's kind of a celebration that was taking place. But Ong said he's not a Thomist. Rather, he said he used it as a good furniture of the mind. So he has the terminology down, and he can use the phrases, but he says that's not exactly what he wants to do. Does that answer it, or is there something?
Yeah, that's good. The second thinker, Marshall McLuhan. What would you say is the relationship between ideas of Marshall McLuhan and ideas of Walter Ong?
They were good friends, but also McLuhan was a teacher of Ong. But Ong was only a few years younger than McLuhan, so they're more friends, I think, than teacher and pupil. And I think Ong took 2 or 3 courses from McLuhan, but said at the time that McLuhan was not speaking about media at the time. His job was to bring in the new criticism from England, and he did a very good job. He was an excellent teacher, Ong said. He got people to think. But he also said that he wasn't influenced by McLuhan in those terms about media. And I think he was probably a little bit sensitive to this because he could recognize Mcluhan was all over the place in Annie Hall and everywhere else, getting a lot of notoriety. And Ong is saying, well, hey, I did that. I was that way. And so he wrote a few people saying that he wasn't brought to his media ideas through Mcluhan.
Okay, shall we go to the next person, or would you like to say anything more?
I think that's good.
Okay. What about Julian Jaynes? I mean, throughout, I see the terms of kind of conscious interiority coming up. Was there any connection between the ideas of Julian Jaynes and Walter Ong?
Ong says almost nothing about him.
Okay.
But he does say that, obviously, he said their works over relate. And that they throw some brilliance on each other.
Got it.
But he didn't believe, he said, that necessarily that the bicameral mind was really needed. He said maybe this is just another way about talking about orality.
Got it. Okay, so as I said, there are some amazing people on this call. So let us just break now into small groups of about 8 people. This will happen automatically. And then in 20 minutes, we're going to come back here. And folks, think of the best question you have for Tom and discuss that amongst yourself. Let's pick the best. And when you come back, you'll have a chance to ask one question to Tom. Okay, so I'm starting the breakout rooms now. Welcome back, folks. So it's time for Q&A. So go ahead. We have we've used the same 4 rules for the past 5 years. Rule number 1, type exclamation mark if you have a question. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, be brief. And rule number 4, speak your mind. Feel free to disagree with anybody on anything and do so courteously. First up is going to be Bill, followed by Mark. Give me just a second. I need to set one thing up here. All right, Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. Tom, can you speak a bit about the role of ambiguity in communication under oral and text conditions? I'll add that under code conditions, ambiguity causes everything to crash, whereas ambiguity can be both a feature and a bug in oral and in text. For example, in diplomacy, people hear what they want to hear. Can you speak a little bit about that and how that is related to Ong's views and your own?
Tom, you need to unmute.
Okay. Yeah. This may not be what you're thinking about. Let me know if it isn't. But for Ong, I think ambiguity would be very important. It would fit into the dimension of the mythos more than anything else. Absolute clarity usually would suggest to him superficiality, for instance. And so I don't think we talked anything about aphorisms today, but Ong and Mcluhan both, as you know, were very big on aphorisms in different ways. Mcluhan was very slick and easy, throwing out very, very, very intriguing ideas. Ong had his embedded into prose passages. But, and I think also in the essay we talked about with wit and he also talks about ambiguity there as one of the devices that would be important to suggest that there is this complement behind every communication that is not able to be encoded. And the mythos is those segments in a sea of facts that ties things together. That would be the mythos part.
Wonderful. Let me elaborate on the, because I think we didn't get to talk about aphorisms. I mean, that's a huge idea. The idea that aphorism actually suggests many things. It's like, it's a short sentence that comes into your mind, and it actually, you know, it's like a blowing up of saying, okay, what are the relationships here? And your mind follows all of them. So it's a very powerful thing, as opposed to a declarative sentence that is like a closed loop. So can you talk a little bit about the role of aphorisms as per, you know, that you can see in Mcluhan's Trivium as well as Ong's work?
As I mentioned, Ong, I mean, we're all familiar with Mcluhan and his aphorisms. And I guess you also remember that in his doctoral dissertation he praised the use of aphorisms, suggesting Pascal's words that the aphorism presents not a thought, but a mind thinking. And this is, you know, it could be a gravestone for Mcluhan type of thing. But likewise, Ong thought that he said he was interested in metaphysics, but metaphysics that were aphoristic statements, such as all text is pretext. There are no statements that are absolutely clear. Okay, I think that's what I got.
Okay, thank you. Next up is going to be Mark, followed by Kevin. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. Mark.
Thank you, Shrikant, for assembling this group, and this is really quite remarkable. My sense is that Ong deserves to have much more attention, and there probably should be a Walter Ong Society that somehow develops out of all of this. And my question to you, Tom, is the following. I made the following statement to Sara, and she expressed some enthusiasm, so I'll do the same with you. It is our view that, and this is neither Mcluhan nor Ong, it is the view of the Center for the Study of Digital Life, at least my own, that the rise of robots will inevitably, and has already begun, to force humanity to ask the question, what's different about that machine and me? And in that forced question, for which humanity really has no answer today, much of the work of Ong on digitization, as well as many other people who've written about this, will necessarily come to the fore and wind up being studied much more. So I do not know, as none of us can, how this will turn out. It may very well be that humanity can't figure out what the difference is. And in some sense, as a result of that, the machines take over. My grandfather, Norbert Wiener, wrote about this in an interview conducted shortly before he died in '64, which he was asked, can the machines take over? And his answer was, well, that depends on what the humans do. If the humans treat these things as gadgets and don't take over from them, then we're in big trouble. Carrying out the assignment I got to deal with these issues when Wiener died and I was 16 years old, here we are. My best guess is that humanity will step up to this challenge. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think Ong does have an answer for this one. And it's an important thing that we probably should have gotten to earlier was Ong's emphasis on memory and the distinction that he would make between memory and recall.
Right.
And memory has a long, long history, as you know, as being important in thinking. And Ong would say that memory is not recollection, that memory is active and vital, and it's fluid and it changes, and it develops out of organic measures and grows with time. Whereas the machine has only recall. It doesn't remember things. It just puts in what comes out. Yeah. And the essay that he has in the book on at the end of the book on Salvatore Dali really highlights this.
Right. Right.
That machines will never, he says, have the power to have memory. But he's been wrong before.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Kevin. Kevin.
Thank you, Tom. My question like this: how can we use language as interpretation makes something morally good or morally bad?
I didn't hear the first part of that.
How can we use language as interpretation? Interpret, let's say, define something good, something bad in morality.
Are you asking whether you can use language as interpretation for the good or for evil, or are you asking about?
You know, this question, Frank, actually from Stefan, still from, let him, you know, rephrase my question.
Stefan, go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah, we were talking about morality in our room, and well, I was private messaging with somebody, and I pretty much came to the conclusion after the room that I think that morality would be determined basically based on the game that you're playing at hand. So like one thing we discussed was like if you're in a committed marriage versus an open marriage, you know, if you have sex with other people in a committed marriage, then it's breaking the rules of the game, so that's immoral. But if you're in an open marriage and you have sex with other people, that's just part of the game. And any situation that you're in has its own set of rules, and a lot of times they're unwritten, unspoken, but you kind of just gotta know them. Like, you know, even in a work environment, you start a new job, you learn who has the most influence, how the whole department is run, and so on and so forth, and you have to follow these rules, or else you kind of get looked down upon, hated, fired, or whatever. So knowing the rules is
Got it.
probably integral. And yeah.
Got it. So let me pose the question this way, Tom. In terms of values and in terms of standards, to what extent are these negotiated through the interpretive oral process, and to what extent in society is it done in written format? What is the role of orality in shaping standards, values in given contexts?
I think, again, the way I was defining orality would be a habit of mind that is previous to the script invention and writing invention. So I don't think that would apply. If you're using orality in the sense of spoken, I'm not sure where to go with that.
Okay, let's go to the next question. It's going to be Laura followed by Mike. Laura, what's your question? Laura, you need to unmute. Okay.
Or still the Stephanie question. Maybe let him ask his question. He helped me.
Okay. Let's see, Laura.
I got it.
Go ahead.
I'm curious, relationship between reading and writing. I would assume that writing as a craft grew to prominence before writing, right? You have to be able to write the word before you can read it, because you have to be able to print the word, right?
Got it. So let me put it as a question.
So, yeah, put it as a question.
Okay. I mean, Walter Ong talks about how these different media shape how you use your consciousness. What does reading do to your consciousness, and what does the writing do to your consciousness? There are people who do mostly reading, not much writing, and there are people who do a lot of writing. What's the difference? Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I don't think I know what the difference is. Somebody else can help.
Sure. I mean, we've talked a lot about this. We've talked about the importance of writing in these meetups, because what writing does is that it develops self-reflective ability of when you put something down, you're able to think about both your thoughts, your feeling. So you have a level of self-reflectivity. You're able to evaluate the precision of it. You're able to organize those thoughts. So it allows your consciousness to operate at a more self-reflective level, more systematic level, more organized level. So that's what I see.
I think I have a sense of that. Maybe that Ong has another famous statement, often repeated, is that the writer's audience is always a fiction. So even when we are sitting and writing, we are imagining there's an audience there, and we have to take in imaginatively what they're thinking and saying in order to put it out. And they also then have to think of what we're doing in order to go back and forth. Now, to say which one is better, I don't know that there's been any demonstration of what that might be.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great point. Next up is going to be Mike, V, Franklin, and Stefan. Mike.
Tom, my question involves how you create some sort of measure of the effectiveness and information content of different modalities of communication. Toward that end, I sort of sense that Ong did not view orality and literacy as binary, but that there was a continuum between the two.
Yes.
And just as Newton needed a different structure to create his laws of physics, and Einstein needed a different structure and mean to create his mathematics, we're similarly ending up in different structures and means of how we talk to machines and how machines talk to each other. And I guess one more thing, before he became political, Chomsky dealt in that area. And I guess our conversation didn't really address that. You have some wisdom to shed on this, I can see.
The part that I picked up on, I think, was your statement that the writing and orality were not binary. And I think that's absolutely clear that it is. And it's one of the many mistakes people make about him, to think that he's got these solid camps. And in fact, his books that he writes, usually like Interfaces of the Word, refer to those gaps or those connections between different modalities and things. The second part, I wasn't quite sure if anybody has an answer to that.
We can skip the second one. It was about Chomsky part. Next up is going to be V, followed by Franklin. V.
I wanted to add how machines talk to each other and how we talk to machines, which I guess was Mark's question.
Okay. Okay, Tom, would you like to say anything about how machines talk to each other and how we talk to machines?
Only to suggest that talk here may be a metaphor. Mm-hmm. Encoding and might be a better approach, or
excellent.
Otherwise, I don't have enough expertise.
Thank you. Next up is V. V, go ahead.
new in this group. Would it be okay if I will answer the question? Just I know there is a gentleman who asked a question about machines, if they have a memory and if they will take over people. Are you okay if I will answer this? What I think?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, V. So the question is, will machines take over?
No, I wanted to ask the question, the gentleman was asking the question about the memory of the machine, like a first gentleman. And I just wanted to say what I think about that. Is it okay with you?
Yes.
I think
Just write a couple of sentences. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I think nowadays machines are taking over, and they will take over because machines do have a memory. And nowadays machine has much more memory than the humans do. And they do have emotions because there is like huge amount of robotics and like robot.
Thank you. V, what we are doing here is that we're just asking questions because
Okay, got it.
we do full meetups on this topic.
Okay, got it. No, thank you.
Join us for a full meetup on this topic. It's a fascinating topic of seeing what the limits of the machines are and what is it. So for example, Walter Ong points out that like human beings, a lot is going on when we are processing things. There is a lot of tacit things which are not explicit, that we have the entire our unconscious where we're bringing in things. We have a lived experience, and all the kind of conscious things that we are manipulating with are conditioned by that huge, large context. So there is a large ground that is behind all of this. Machines don't have that. And so there are kind of fundamental differences. So it's a very large question, and we'll go into it in great amount of detail. Thank you. Next up is Franklin.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So you talked about the dichotomy of logos and mythos, and I think of this in terms of the mind and the heart. And that feels relevant to Ong's idea of I and thou. That and does this relate to the idea that the mind, the logos, can live its life trying to build civilization and big, triumphant towers, but then an event will cause the whole thing to just be reduced to ashes, and suddenly the wisdom of the heart becomes much more paramount. And what the mind thought was this all important, goal in life is reduced to ashes, and out of the ashes comes the phoenix, which is the heart mind that says, no, it's love, it's relationships, it's what's going on right here between us. Does that have any relevance to Ong, or am I reading into it? And thank you.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I'm not sure what Ong would have to say about that.
Thank you. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, throughout the reading of your book is that Ong keeps going back and forth between the heart and the mind. He keeps going back and forth between writing and orality. He deeply believes that there has to be this loop going relentlessly between digitization and hermeneutics. You have to interpret. There has to be living conversation with everything that we are producing, which is digitized out there, and whether it is on paper in our own handwriting or print or electronic. So that loop is the one that keeps it tied to existence, to the deep realities of what we are trying to do. So I think that, and he builds that in. He's arguing for it being there all the time, that he's saying it's dangerous to go off just with text. You need to bring in the entire context. So thank you. Next up is Patricia.
Yes, hi, thank you. Tom, I wanted to actually, hopefully you can point me in a direction. I actually read an article that you wrote about in regards to Dali's painting, that on the persistence of memory. And you posed a question about whether digitization is actually inhibiting us from forming real, true memories, that we're relying on this digitization memory, which isn't human. It doesn't have a conscious or an unconscious. It's not, you said living memories that echo and resonate, understandings and relationships that escape digitization. Do you know if anyone's trying to answer that question?
I think it was answered, although I'm misunderstanding what you're saying. That the title of the painting by Dali was The Persistence of Memory, which if I walked up to the painting without knowing what it was, I don't think I would have come up with that term. So that somehow or another, what's going on here is very important. And I would take issue with the fact that machines have memory in the way that Ong is referring to memory. That memory is something that we are born with. I can remember coming out of the womb, for instance. Mark Twain said, I can remember anything, whether it happened or not. And now that I'm older, I can only remember the latter. Our memories are alive and they're changing. I'm not sure everything I told you about Ong was true, but that's what I remember at this point. And when I remember remembering it, it's going to be different again. With the computer, what you put in is what's going to come out. That's what recall is. And that's important. If you want my social security number and all my payments done, you better get that right. But that's not the same as talking about who am I as an individual and a human. I think a computer could probably replace me, but I'm not sure the rest of you.
Okay, next up is Stefan, followed by Tom. Stefan.
Okay, Tom. So you mentioned something at the beginning that I was wondering if you could elaborate on. You were mentioning a bunch of examples of, I think, dualities.
Or dialectical pairs.
Yes, could you elaborate on that whole thing?
Brought it up in reference to Ong, who thought, along with Hannah Arendt, that he was a dialectical thinker. And we're trying to demonstrate that through his career, what Ong was continually was about were these dialectical pairs given new names. They're not exactly the same, but they all have the same type of relevance. And so in one book, he's going to pick up mythos versus logos. But another, he's going to talk about hermeneutics and digitization, rhetoric and logic. In all cases, he's saying that both of the pairs are important, but hopefully there'll be some synthesis that comes out of them, or some type of balancing that will take place. Does that do it?
And how would you, I guess one, how would you go about balancing them? That might be pretty broad. And two, or do you know like a reference of like where I could find a list of all of these, like everything that you mentioned, like any reading material?
Well, no. I think some of these would be discussed in the book we were talking about today, Language as Hermeneutic. But I can't think of a work that parallels these. I'm not saying this was innovative by any means, but I don't know of anybody that simply went down the columns.
Stefan, I think Tom did a good job of listing about half a dozen more at the beginning of this meetup. So just look up the video of this as soon as I publish it, and it has those. That's a good start. Next up is going to be Tom Gilp. Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Good name, Tom. I'm only 35% of the way through the book, so forgive me, and I'm fascinated by it. I've highlighted an awful lot of it. But my question is, I want more information, if you have it, or discussion on the difference between written text reflecting the oral and visual information such as drawings or illustrations, leaving aside things like Chinese ideograms?
I'm not sure of the question.
Okay, let me try again. What did Ong have to say about visual drawings and illustrations as a form of written communication?
Randy, you can correct me, but I don't think anything.
That's why I'm missing it. Okay.
Randy, would you like to add anything? You're on mute right now. Of what role did, yeah, go ahead.
I don't think he would see writing or drawing pictures as a form of writing. I guess it might, I don't know how that would compute exactly. But he does have an article, and I'm trying to remember the topic or the title, Tom, you may, but it's about how buildings, especially prominent public buildings, could become memorized as a way to different features of the building could be linked with different kinds of ideas or whatnot as a scheme for remembering things. And
I think it's called Memory Palace.
The memory palace. Yeah, I don't think that's what he's talking about, though. The
well, yeah, no, but so there would be a place where a building could be associated with thought as a way of as a tactic for organizing ideas, but that's about the only place I could think of where he would come close to thinking.
That's not coming out of a written tradition. That's more of an oral tradition, a memory device.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Randy. All right. Tom, this was excellent. This is a very deep topic, and what we do is that we kind of go through this, meetup after meetup after meetup. So it's wonderful to have, Sara and you talk. And Randy, I look forward to having you. I'll communicate with you, and we'll figure out another time, and we'll have kind of a deeper communication, a deeper conversation on who was Walter Ong and what does he have to offer to all of us. All right. So thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, everybody. See you folks soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thanks a lot, Shrikant.
Bye.
Bye-bye.